to get back into our Father's Word, the fourth book of Moses, Bamidbar in the Hebrew, in the wilderness. And we're nearing the time when that generation who was judged to die in the wilderness would not enter the promised land. That time is drawing near. And as Israel, we're going to pick it up with Israel making their way finally toward the promised land. But again, that generation won't be allowed to enter. Now, in our last lecture, we saw once again the people of Israel complaining and murmuring against Moses. Why'd you bring us out here in this wilderness to die? There's no food, there's no water, and we loathe this light bread, the manna that God was preparing and delivering to them to keep them from starving to death. And God was furious. He had fiery serpents go forth and bite the people, and the people were dying as a result of it. And the people came crying to Moses, "We've sinned, Moses, please pray for us." And the intercessor once again interceded for the people, and God had Moses make a copper or a brazen serpent and raise it up on a standard or a pole. And if the people would look upon the fiery serpent, they would not die. And I took you to in the New Testament, St. John chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, where it states that just as Moses raised that serpent up on the standard, the Son of Man, that being Jesus Christ, would also be lifted up, whereby those who looked upon him would also be saved. In other words, those who would believe on him. So with that introduction, let's ask that word of wisdom in Yeshua, Jesus' precious name. Father, we ask you to open eyes, open ears this day. Chapter 21, verse 9 in the book of Numbers, and it reads, "And Moses made a serpent of brass, and put it upon a pole or a standard. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived." And this required a little bit of faith on the part of the one who had been bitten by the fiery serpent. And I think God had every right to ask for that bit of faith, because we had a bad problem with these people not believing in the Lord. But if they were bitten by the fiery serpent and they did not look upon this serpent, they died. If they looked upon the serpent, because God said, if you will look upon the serpent, and then showing faith and looking upon it, then they would live, just as those who look upon Jesus Christ would live. Now, in the Apocrypha, there is a book called The Wisdom of Solomon. And if you have an Apocrypha, you might make a note of the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 16, verses 6 and 7. And it states there that it was not, the reason that the people were saved was not because of what they saw, but because of God, and He being the Savior of all. And that's Wisdom of Solomon in the Apocrypha 16, 6, and 7. Now, this brass serpent would be carried by Israel into the Promised Land, and you read of it even in the Bible as late as 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 4. And it's not a good thing that was going on there in 2 Kings 18:4, because the people had stopped worshiping the Lord and started worshiping this serpent that Moses had made. They were offering incense to it. And when Hezekiah discovered that, he had it, Hezekiah, if you're not familiar, one of the more righteous kings of Judah, and when he found out that the people were offering incense to the brass serpent, that was it for the brass serpent. He had it stamped into pieces and destroyed. Verse 10. "And the children of Israel set forward and pitched in Oboth." Oboth means water skins. The word pitched means that they encamped, working their way, circumferencing Edom, and, as we'll see, also Moab, going around a long way, but eventually going to make their way to Jordan and cross over into the Promised Land. And they journeyed from Oboth and pitched at Izi-Abarim in the wilderness, which is before Moab, toward the sun rising, on the east side, in other words, of Moab. Moab, I'll remind you, one of the sons of Lot, Ammon being the other by Lot's own daughters. And these are Adamic people. Lot was the nephew of Abraham. And God instructed, He made it very clear, you're not to war with your brethren. Deuteronomy chapter 2, Israel was instructed not to make war against Ammon or Moab. Deuteronomy chapter 3, the same prohibition was placed on warring against Edom, because they were Adamic peoples. Verse 12, from thence they removed and pitched in the valley of Zared. Verse 13, from thence they removed and pitched, or encamped, on the other side of Arnon, a river, which is in the wilderness that cometh out of the coasts, or the border, it could be translated, of the Amorites. For Arnon is the border of Moab, between Moab and the Amorites. And all of this being explained very carefully, and I want to just mention that God said you won't war against Moab. But what had happened was, in the years preceding this, the Amorites, who were a very ferocious Canaanitish tribe, took part of Moab's land, and that's what's going on here. It's not that Israel is going to make war against Moab, as it may sound here. It's simply stating the fact that the Amorites had taken a big part of the land of the Moabites. Verse 14, wherefore, or maybe better translated, therefore, it is said or written in the book of the wars of the Lord, what He did in the Red Sea and in the brooks of Arnon. And this probably a collection of odes that go all the way back to the time of Moses. And this, what he did in the Red Sea, or the book of the wars, actually, some of you it's what he did. Those of you with reference Bibles, some of you even have that this could be translated Baheb in Suphah, which is one of the Amoritish fortresses. And this is really not a good translation. I think what it's saying here is that the latter phrase is saying that there was an Amoritish fortress, and Yahweh took it by storm. The Lord leading finally His people into Israel, and this new generation is going to have the faith and the confidence in Him to trust Him to deliver them into the Promised Land, finally. Verse 15, and at the stream of the brooks that goeth down to the dwelling of Ar, and lieth upon the border of Moab. Now, Ar, a city that was at least a capital over a portion of Moab. And this is describing how far the Amorites, how much of Moab's land the Amorites had taken. And from thence they went to Beer. Beer means well. That is the well whereof the Lord spake unto Moses, gather the people together, and I will give them water. And He commanded that wells be dug, is what happened here. 17, then Israel sang this song, spring up, O well, sing ye unto it, commemorating the divine gift of grace that the Lord provided in providing water to the people of Israel. But this time he's not going to make it so easy that he gives it to the people out of a rock. And they're going to have to work for it and dig some wells. 18. The princes digged the well. The nobles of the people digged it. Everybody with the shovel in hand, if I can say it that way. By the direction of the lawgiver with their staves, and from the wilderness or the desert they went to Mattanah, and Mattanah meaning gift of the Lord, and the water was a gift to them. In most places, you know, in the Bible you see lawgiver. Moses comes to mind, but I think this refers to the Lord himself, as it's written in Isaiah chapter 33, verse 22 of the Lord, that he is the judge, he is the king, he is the lawgiver. Beer probably the same as Beer Elam, as it's seen in Isaiah chapter 15, verse 8, on the northeast of the territory that did belong to Moab. Verse 19, and from Mattanah to Nahaliel, and from Nahaliel to Bamoth, Israel on the march to the promised land, finally. Verse 20, and from Bamoth in the valley, that is in the country of Moab, to the top of Pisgah, which looketh toward Jeshimon, and Jeshimon meaning face of the desert. And again, don't think that Israel is going to try and fight against Moab or in Moab's territory. What this is describing is this land at one time did belong to Moab, but it belonged to the Amorites at the time. Pisgah, most of you probably realize, is the final stopping place of Moses. From Pisgah, which actually means the hill, or hill in Hebrew, you could literally see across Jordan into the promised land. And this would be the hill where Moses would pass away. He would be allowed to see the promised land, but not enter the promised land. Now, God about to build the confidence and the trust of the people, the younger generation, finally seeing some progress. Can you imagine, for some 38 to 40 years, they've been wandering around out in the desert, really with no sense of direction, given up on the older generation as far as entering. They probably heard about this land that flowed with milk and honey. From, if nothing else, the stories of the spies who went into the land. But here, finally, they're seeing some results and moving toward the promised land. I'm sure that it brought joy to the younger generation's heart. Verse 21, and Israel sent messengers unto Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, now, what they're going to do, Israel is going to ask of Sihon the same thing that they asked of Edom, and that was, let us stick on the king's highway. We won't turn left or right. We won't go into your fields or your vineyards and destroy your crops. We won't steal your water. All we ask is that you let us go through your land, and it would be easier going for us. 22, let me, this is speaking of Israel, pass through thy land. We will not turn into the fields or into the vineyards. We will not drink of the waters of the well, but we will go along by the king's highway until we be past thy borders. Again, just as they asked of Edom. 23. And Sihon would not suffer Israel to pass through his border. In fact, make a note of Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 30, and you'll learn that the Lord hardened Sihon's spirit into the fact that he would not allow Israel to pass. More on that in a moment. But Sihon gathered all his people together and went out against Israel into the wilderness. And he came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. And again, God's original plan, Canaan, the land of Canaan, was on the west side of Jordan. And he also instructed Israel, you won't make war against the Adamic peoples, the Moabites, the Ammonites, and Edom, because I gave them that land to live in. So, but here the Amorites have taken part of Moab's land, and so that opens up an opportunity for the people of Israel to have some of the land on the east side of Jordan. And this was a particularly good land for those with herds and flocks. And eventually the tribes of Gad, Reuben, and half Manasseh, who had a lot of herds and flocks, would petition the Lord through Moses that they might make their land, their inheritance, in the land on the east side of Jordan. And God gave them permission to do that. However, he said, when you cross Jordan, all of Israel, into the promised land, Gad, Reuben, and half Manasseh, you leave your herds and your women and your children on the east side, but the warriors, you go with Israel into the promised land. And then when the promised land, the victory has been made, then you can cross back over Jordan to your families and your homes there. 24. And Israel smote him with the edge of the sword. And this means, in the Hebrew, a figure of speech, without quarter. And possessed his land from Arnon, this is a river on the east side of Jordan, unto Jabbok, even unto the children of Ammon, also a son of Lot. For the border of the children of Ammon was strong. Now this doesn't quite carry what actually happened, and the fact that the border of Ammon was fortified or strong is the reason that the Amorites did not take part of the land of Ammon as well as part of the land of Moab, and that's what's being said there. Make a note of Judges chapter 11, because all this land that we're talking about here, some 300 years later, at the time of one of the judges, many think self-appointed judges, myself being one of those who think Jephthah appointed himself, but there was an event that happened there in Judges chapter 11 where the king of Ammon came up against the people of Israel on the east side of Jordan and said, give us back our land. And Jephthah said, wait a minute, Israel did not take that land from you. Israel took that land from the Amorites. It wasn't Moab or Ammon's land. It was at one time Moab's land, but the Amorites took it, and then Israel took it from the Amorites. And Jephthah was right. And he said, you, the king of Ammon, and the Ammonites, you need to take the land that Chemosh, which was their god, small g, gives you, and we'll keep the land that Yahweh has given us. So the same land, some 300 years later, became the subject of contention between the Ammonites and the Israelites at the time of the judge Jephthah. Verse 25. And Israel took all these cities, and Israel dwelt in all the cities of the Amorites in Heshbon and in all the villages thereof. And this villages in the Hebrew is daughters, and it's often used of smaller towns around a large city, such as Heshbon here is given. It would be the smaller towns around Heshbon as well. And actually, the actual settlement didn't begin until Moses gave the land at the Lord's instructions to Reuben and Gad, and which we'll see in chapter 32 when we get there in this book of Numbers. 26, for Heshbon was the city of Sihon, the king of the Amorites. who had fought against the former king of Moab. Here we're getting a little bit clearer on whose land this was. And taken all his land out of his hand, even unto Arnon. And that was exactly the way things came down. In fact, that's what Jephthah made very clear when he was arguing his case against the Ammonites in Judges chapter 11. 27. Wherefore, or therefore, they that speak in proverbs, these are songs in commemoration of the victory over the Amorites, say, Come unto Heshbon, let the city of Sihon be built and prepared. And this is stated ironically to the Amorites. What this means is that we whipped your tails good. Why don't you come to Heshbon and build and restore the city of Heshbon? And no intention made for them to do so, but kind of said sarcastically, if you will. 28, and this is how the songs of those who commemorated the victory over the Amorites went. For there is a fire gone out of Heshbon, a flame from the city of Sihon. It hath consumed Ar of Moab, the capital of Moab, and the lords of the high places of Arnon. The Moabites as far as Sihon had conquered, in other words. Verse 29, Woe to thee, Moab! Thou art undone, O people of Chemosh. This was one of their gods. The Ammonites also worship Chemosh, Chemosh being related to Molech, the god, small g, who the people would pass their children through the fire in sacrifice. He, referring to Moab, hath given his sons that escaped and his daughters into captivity unto Sihon, king of the Amorites. Moab totally lost, and those who survived the war with the Amorites were made subject to the Amorites. In other words, they're saying, your God, Chemosh, delivered you from, your God could not deliver you from your conquerors, the Amorites, and our God gave a victory to us over those who conquered you. Verse 30, We have shot at them, Heshbon is perished, even unto Dibon, and we have laid them waste even unto Nophah, which reached unto Medeba. And these are cities or areas located in the land that was conquered, and basically saying from one end to the other, Dibon being the furthest south, Nophah in the northeast, and Medeba in the southeast, just 2 hours southeast of Heshbon. In other words, from one end of the kingdom to the other, God gave us the victory. Now the victory has been had over the Amorites. Now we're going to get to the big boys. 31. Thus Israel dwelt in the land of the Amorites. And Moses sent to spy out Jahazer. Jahazer was a part of the Amorites' land. And they took the villages thereof, and drove out the Amorites that were there, that completing the victory over the Amorites. And now come the big boys. By the way, they spy, and that, check that out in the Strong's, is a reconnaissance or actually a smaller army. 33, and they turned and went up by the way of Bashan. And Og, the king of Bashan, went out against them, he and all his people, to the battle of Edrei. Now, Og, those of you who may or may not know, was of the descendants of the Nephilim. He was a Geber of the giants, and I mean, he was a big one. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11, it reads that his bed was 9 cubits in length and 4 cubits in breadth. And depending on whose cubit you go by, that could have been anywhere from 13 to 18 feet in length and then 6 to 8 feet wide. So he was a big one. And you know what's funny about this? Well, let me go another verse and then we'll talk about it. Verse 34. And the Lord said unto Moses, fear him not. Don't be afraid of the giants. For I have delivered him into thy hand, and all his people and his land, and thou shalt do to him as thou didst unto Sihon, king of the Amorites. And they smote them with the sword without quarter, which dwelt at Heshbon. Pretty good odds for a victory when the Lord says, I'm going to give them to you. And it's odd to me that here, you remember back in chapter 13, we had the 12 spies of Israel that went into the promised land, and some 40 years earlier. And they came back out of the promised land and said, oh, it's a good land, all right. There, look at all these grapes that we got. One cluster of grapes, and it took 2 men to bear it. But they said there's giants over there. And there's no way that we were like grasshoppers in their sight. There's no way we can take that land from the giants. And had they trusted and believed in the Lord, they would have been into the promised land 40 years earlier and not wandering around in the wilderness, but finally trusting in God and taking care of the giants. 35. So they smote him, referring to Og and his sons and all his people, until there was none left him alive, and they possessed his land. God always keeps his promises. If he tells you, I'll give you the victory, and you can enter the promised land, you're going to have the victory, and you can enter the promised land. And there are no giants that can prevent you from doing so. Satan himself cannot prevent you from entering the promised land if you trust and believe in the Lord. Now imagine this. You've got 2.1 to 2.4 million people, by my estimation. That's based on the fact that there were 603,550 fighting men numbered at the beginning of this book of Numbers, moving through the wilderness. Now, that large a group does not move from one place to another unnoticed by the other peoples. And what we're going to see in the next several chapters, as a matter of fact, the events of the Moabites. And we have a king of Moab called Balak, and he sees this with his spies, sees the people of Israel moving from location to location. They see Israel defeat the Amorites. They see Israel defeat even the giants, Og and his, and now they've moved up on their border. And again, that doesn't go unnoticed at this time. So, in a nutshell, Moab is shaking in their boots. They're thinking, here we got these 2.1 to 2.4 million people with 600,000 army, and they're looking for land. They took the land from the Amorites, and after all, you remember the Amorites are the ones who took that land from us, Moab speaking, and now they want our land as well. So it's causing quite a stir in the land of Moab, and not only in Moab, but also in the neighboring nations as well. What's going to happen is Balak is going to try and hire Balaam to curse the nation of Israel to weaken them so that he and his armies, and maybe if he can round up a couple of allies, can defeat this nation of Israel and prevent them from taking their land. Israel had no interest in their land because God had already told them, I gave that land to Ammon, I gave that land to Moab, I gave some of the land to Edom. You don't try and take it away from them. Chapter 22, verse 1, the events of Balaam and his ass. Chapter 22, verse 1. And the children of Israel set forward and pitched in the plains of Moab on this side Jordan by Jericho, on the east side of Jordan, and not in the land of Moab, but the plains of Moab, which was on the border of what Moab had left, what little they had that the Amorites hadn't taken. 2. And Balak, the son of Zippor, Balak, by the way, translated means spoiler, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. And he was frightened. 3. And Moab was sore afraid, this word is vehemently afraid, of the people of Israel, because they were many. And Moab was distressed because of the children of Israel. And in Deuteronomy chapter 2, 28, it's written that Israel even tried to pay Moab for the water and food, and they wouldn't hear of it. And my point is that Moab had no reason to be afraid of Israel, because Israel didn't try and forcibly take the food and water or their land. They offered to pay for the food and water. Verse 3, or 4 I should say, and then we'll stop for the day. And Moab said unto the elders of Midian, Midian, you can figure out who those people are, make a note of Genesis chapter 25, the first 3 verses will document that Midian was the son of Abraham and Keturah. So again, Adamic peoples. Now shall this company lick up all that are round about us, as the ox licketh up the grass of the field. And Balak, the son of Zippor, was king of the Moabites at that time. Now, this really loses it in the translation. Moab, being afraid of what Israel's intentions are, goes to his neighbor Midian and says, and that's a figure of speech, like an ox licketh up the grass. He's saying, look what they did to the Amorites. Look what they did to Og. And do you think they're going to stop there? They're going to lick us up, all the neighbors, Moab and their neighbors like Midian, if we don't do something about that. Are you with me? And we'll come back in our next lecture and see what their plan is and how it comes to pass. It's an interesting study. I hope you'll join us. We got a short message. We'll ask you to listen a moment, won't you please?